create a nuclear arms race. Then Thursday night, I arrived in Munich for the security conference at Munich. I started going there in 1999 with Senator McCain. It's the premier Super Bowl of foreign policy for the world every year. You have foreign ministers and defense ministers and heads of state from all over the world to come to Munich. The original conference was NATO-centric. It was called the Verkunde, and it was basically NATO allies would meet in Munich every year to assess the situation of the world. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became more international in scope. So, where do we stand regarding Russia, Ukraine? Yesterday, February the 21st, 2022, President Putin of Russia rewrote the European map. He declared Ukraine as an independent sovereign nation dead. He said it was a puppet colony of the West, and it was pretty clear to what he was saying to me that Ukraine is Russia. It's not a sovereign independent nation. What does that matter to people in South Carolina? Anytime someone takes something owned by another through force and they get away with it, incentivizes more bad action. When you lose the streets of your hometown to criminals, then you can't do business and you can't walk safely at night, you can't enjoy life. The same is true for the world order in terms of international relations. So in 1994, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Ukraine, Russia, and Great Britain and the United States signed the Budapest Memorandum. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, along with the other Soviet satellite states, declared their independence and became a sovereign nation. They had the third largest nuclear inventory in the world. A lot of the Soviet Union missile force was in Ukraine. So what happened in '94 is that there was a negotiation between Ukraine, Russia, Britain, and the United States, whereby Ukraine would give up the nuclear force in exchange for a guarantee and a pledge to honor its sovereignty. The Russians signed that agreement. In 1994, no one doubted that Crimea was part of Ukraine. No one doubted that Donbass, the region in question today, was part of Ukraine. How many people believe now, given what happened yesterday, that Ukraine would have done this deal? And does it matter that 25 years ago you sign an agreement with Russia and they tear it up and invade your country? Yes, it does matter, because Russia wants more than Ukraine. The speech yesterday by Putin was incredibly unnerving. Again, what does it mean to people in South Carolina? Gas is going to go up significantly because the invasion in Ukraine by Russia is going to be disruptive to the oil and gas supply of the world. Putin will be enriched because I would expect that oil prices will go to probably north of $100 a barrel. That will hit you at the pump. Ukraine is the fourth largest exporter of wheat, the fifth largest exporter of corn for the world. So that market is going to be disrupted, so you'll see an increase in food prices. You'll also see China and Iran becoming more provocative. China is making the same type claims against an island called Taiwan. For years and decades, the United States has been helping Taiwan maintain its independence and its democracy. China has been very threatening. If we allow Russia to get away with destroying the Ukraine, it's just a matter of time till China takes over Taiwan, creating the same type ripple effect that I've just described by Russia's seizure of parts of Ukraine. The Iranians are watching very closely. The Israelis are very worried that the Iranians are marching toward a nuclear bomb, not peaceful nuclear power, and an agreement with Iran and the United States, the JCPOA round 2 may be coming soon, which I think will fall well short of what we need. So my point to people here at home is you can expect gas prices to go up, you can expect food costs to go up, and I can tell you from history, anytime we sit silent and watch the rights of one group be eviscerated, it's just a matter of time till it comes back to haunt us. This is the 1930s all over again. What Putin did yesterday was tear up an agreement made 25 years ago. That's exactly what Hitler did in the 30s. And the response to Hitler was one appeasement after another, to the point that it got so far out of hand that we had to act. And that's what created World War II. Do I think there'll be a third world war over Russia's seizure of Ukraine? No, but I do believe there's going to be conflict at every turn. And the stability we've enjoyed in Europe that's benefited the United States is going to be lost. So if I were in Poland today, who's a NATO member, by the way, living in the shadow of Russia, instead of giving up a nuclear weapon, I'd be trying to acquire one. If I were the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, very small nations, very proud democracies, being threatened every day by Russia, I would be worried. Because the Budapest Memorandum wound up meaning nothing. The guarantees given by Russia in 1994 were wiped out yesterday by Putin. The NATO commitments we've made to each other since the end of World War II, Article 5 commitments, are now in question. If you're in the Baltics, if you're Poland, and other nations living in the shadow on the front lines of Russian aggression, there has to be some doubt in your mind as to where Article 5 really will be invoked. All I can say is I support President Biden's decision to beef up American presence in NATO allies surrounding Russia to make NATO stronger, not weaker. We have one president at a time. President Biden is the President of the United States, and to the extent that I can help him push back against Putin and bring stability to the world, I will gladly do so. I will not be part of an appeasement movement that will lead to further conflict. I've been on the phone to Democratic senators for the last 2 days. We're talking about an emergency supplemental to be created next week that would create a task force of the Department of Justice, Department of State, Treasury, maybe DOD, to go after the oligarchs who enrich themselves from Putin's misadventures. It's now time for that crowd to lose their yachts, lose their luxury apartments, and to pay a price of being part of a thuggish group, a nation state that really is a mafia state. To the Russian people, you can expect bad things to come your way. I do not believe the Russian people are an enemy of the United States. They don't have a whole lot to say about what happens in their country. You speak up in Russia, you get poisoned. You speak up in Russia, you go to jail. It is a dictatorship and a kleptocracy. One of the richest people in the world is Putin. Not because he's created some great idea for the world, he's stolen his people blind. And I want this task force to go after Putin's assets personally. And I want the Russian people to understand what's happened to them during Putin's tenure. I want to put money on the table to help NATO allies living in the shadow of Russia regarding cyber attacks. I would expect in the coming days, if not hours, more cyber attacks against Ukraine. Ukraine is a democracy. Democracies are good in my view. I can't remember a war between two democracies in the history of the world. So the more democracy, the better. It's complicated and messy. If we allow Ukraine's democracy to be destroyed and agreements to be ripped up by Putin, there is no end to this. Stability in Europe is now lost And what we do regarding Putin's invasion of Ukraine has a lot to say about, a lot to do with whether or not other areas of the world will get completely out of hand. So what to do? We should increase oil and gas production here to lessen the blow to the American consumer, but we won't. We should reopen the Keystone Pipeline so we'll be less dependent on oil and gas coming from Russia. In 2018, the number of barrels of oil that we got from Russia was incredibly low, in the thousands. It's, I think, increased tenfold because we have become energy dependent, not independent. We should secure our border tomorrow because terrorism is on the march in the Mideast, headed our way, and it's probably going to come across the border. So the emergency supplemental needs to help our allies, needs to provide more assistance to the Ukraine. We need to create a mechanism for Putin and his cronies to pay a heavy price to deter further aggression. This idea of trying to sit down and rationally talk with Putin is folly. The only thing that Putin will understand is a strong response. Here's the good news. Russia is a nation, gas station masquerading as a nation, as my friend John McCain said. They have an economy the size of Italy. Their primary source of income is oil and gas. I would like to kick them out of the SWIFT program, which allows them to do normal banking practices. I would like to do everything I can to give Europe alternatives to Russian oil and gas. I'd like to go after Putin and his cronies as hard as we can. I would like to make life miserable for Putin and those who support him, because if we don't, other bad actors are going to move quickly in other areas. And the nightmare scenario is aggression by Taiwan, China, Iran, Russia, and others all at once. So to President Biden, you said a couple of years ago that Putin does not want you to win because you're the only person that could go toe-to-toe with him. Well, right now, Mr. President, you're playing footsie with Putin and you're losing. He's walking all over you and our allies. We have too many Neville Chamberlains in this world. We need more Churchills. President Zelensky of Ukraine rose to the occasion when he gave his speech in Munich. He told the audience, the Western world, the smart people, that everything you've done is now in question. It didn't work. My nation is being savaged. You need to adjust your policies. Whether you help us or not, we're going to fight, because we're not going to give up our freedom, because we have tasted it, and we're not going to go back to the good old days of living under the thumb of the Soviet Union or Russia. So I thought that the president of Ukraine did his part. Now it's time for the Congress and the President of the United States, working with Western allies, to give such a firm and forceful response to Putin that this will end sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Senator Graham, when you're talking about a forceful response, you're still pretty much talking about sanctions. You're not talking about boots on the ground in Ukraine.
There will be no American military members on the ground in Ukraine because they're not part of NATO. There should be a dramatic increase of American presence along with our NATO allies in NATO nations that border Russia. We are sending fighters to Poland. We're sending additional soldiers to the Baltic nations, but our NATO allies also need to do more. As Putin tries to dismember NATO, we need to try to make it stronger. What is he up to? He does not want a democracy on his border. He's making territorial claims that would reconfigure the world where the Soviet Union comes back to life, or the old Russian Empire. And he's testing us, and he will get away with as much as he can. He's willing for his army to accept casualties. He has no value or regard for human life or the Russian people. I say that given his behavior. But I do believe that people around him, if they're forced to suffer, may begin to speak differently. If all the oligarchs who have enriched themselves by being part of Putin's inner circle all of a sudden find themselves losing their yachts, their luxury homes throughout the world, and can't travel and maybe go to jail, it may change the equation. If we can isolate the oil and gas economy of Russia and try to find alternatives to Russian oil and gas for our European allies, it will slowly but surely bleed Russia dry, and maybe one day the people will speak out and push back. But no, U.S. troops on the ground would be necessary because Ukraine's not a member of NATO. Cyber attacks are going to be a method that Putin uses to intimidate the region and maybe come after us. I think one of the things he's going to test is whether or not America has the will to push back, and we've lost a pipeline to the East Coast a few months ago that was shut down through cyber attacks emanating from Russia. So I do worry that he will test us as a nation and maybe launch cyber attacks against us. If he does, he should get such an overwhelming response that he would not do it again.
Senator Graham, how soon could this task force be formed and implemented?
I've been on the phone all morning. We've got members of the Senate all over the world. We had a big group in Munich, and we sort of agreed that if Putin does what he's done, that we have to respond forcefully. And there was a consensus by Democrats and Republicans that one of the soft underbellies of Putin's world is the lavish lifestyles that he supports through the oligarch system that keeps him in power. That if we started going after their assets and Putin's assets, that may make a difference in terms of future misadventure. So the task force should be the #1 priority of this emergency supplemental. We should help Ukraine militarily through aid. We should help them defend themselves against cyber attacks. We should help NATO allies, particularly the Baltic nations, with their problems they've had with cyber attacks emanating from Putin.
Senator, you mentioned cyber attacks a couple times now. And any plans in the works to really caution or tighten down to prevent these from happening?
Well, so we had a discussion with our military leaders. There is, Article 5 is a commitment among NATO nations that an attack of one against one is an attack against all. The only time Article 5 has ever been invoked in the history of NATO was after 9/11. It was such a severe attack on the United States that NATO invoked Article 5 to our benefit. And what I'm saying is that cyber attacks coming from Russia need to be considered in terms of Article 5 responsibilities. If Russia blew up the pipeline of the United States tomorrow through kinetic activity, we would respond very forcefully. If they shut down a pipeline or a power plant or anything else through cyber attacks, we should have a firm response, and we should have rules of engagement. We should increase our offensive capability, and we should very clearly tell Putin what's off limits. And if we don't, we're going to make a huge mistake.
Senator, should more have been done by the United States?
Is this guy a journalist, or you know?
Yeah, he's from a radio station.
Okay, come on in. Yeah, let him in. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry about that. There you go. Sorry about that. Okay. That's all right. That's good. I'm sorry.
Sir, should more have been done by the United States leading up to this point?
Oh my God. Should more have been done by the United States leading up to the point? Yes. What you see happening is being run over by a truck in Kansas that you see coming miles away, doing about 20 miles an hour, and you stand in the middle of the road and you eventually get run over. The intel for the last 9 months, is he part of this group? Yeah. Let him in. Yeah. Yeah, sorry about that. All right. So let's start over here again. So the intel community has been telling us for the last 9 months that there's a military buildup occurring and that Putin is being more aggressive, and he's made a decision to dismember the Ukraine. By declaring these two provinces independent, he's destroyed the sovereignty of Ukraine. That's an attack on Ukraine. So what should we have done? We should have been coming up with alternatives to Russian oil and gas. We shut down our pipeline, the Keystone Pipeline, and we let Putin build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is a cash cow running into Germany to supply gas to Europe coming out of Russia. We should have an alternative to that. We should have been thinking about that a very long time ago. We should have upped the ante in terms of providing more defensive capability to Ukraine so that there'd be more Russian soldiers and body bags going back to Moscow. We're playing catch up. It's like Afghanistan. We withdrew without a plan. And Afghanistan looms large regarding every meeting I had. After Afghanistan, people questioned the capability, the resolve, and the competency of the United States. But for the last 9 months, we have been yelling to the Biden administration, up your game. I have been pushing sanctions for pre-invasion activity. Let's don't wait to invade the country. Let's punish him, Putin, for the provocation of putting 150,000 troops on Ukraine's border. What did Zelensky say in Munich? If you believe he's going to invade, why don't you tell him now what you're going to do? When you're weak, you don't have the luxury of ambiguity. A strong person can be clever and can create doubt, because a strong person, you really don't know what they're going to do, but you know they're strong. If you're perceived to be weak, you've got to be clear. So the biggest mistake we've made in the last 30 days is not to write down what happens to Putin if there's an invasion, or in my case, punish him for what he's already done. The administration has pushed back against bipartisan sanctioned legislation that had pre-invasion consequences to Putin that were really tough on the oil and gas sector, believing that if we did that up front, it would be a provocation, it would make him more likely to invade. The Biden administration has misjudged Putin about as badly as anyone since the world misjudged Hitler.
Senator Graham, how much do you see Ukrainian invasion becoming a linchpin moment for a lot of the scenarios you're describing, i.e. China,
Okay, great.
similar situations? And can you make that argument maybe more to people in your own party who are questioning the whole
Yeah.
reason we're responding in this situation?
Okay, I have some very close friends say, what does it matter to the Ukraine? Okay, let's just talk about that for a moment. It matters when agreements are no longer worth the paper they're written on. So if you allow Putin to tear up the Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, believing their sovereignty would be respected, who's going to sign future agreements making the world a safer place? If you don't realize that the destruction of democracy in the Ukraine makes autocratic leaders more likely to attack other democracies, you're sort of living in dreamland. If you don't realize that an invasion of Ukraine by Russia will throw the oil and gas markets into disarray, you don't understand the oil and gas economy. If you don't understand that the inflation problems here at home will get worse if Ukraine is destroyed as we know it, because they produce so many commodities in the area of corn and wheat. So this idea that Ukraine doesn't matter to our economy and law and order in the world makes no sense. The same people who are doubting whether we should do anything in Ukraine are the biggest hawks when it comes to riots in the street. To those who believe that if you allow a city to be taken over by thugs, businesses to be ransacked, and wholesale stealing, and nobody does anything about it, that city is lost its way, you're right. The same is true in the world. When you allow one country to take the land of another by force of arms, nobody's safe anywhere. So Taiwan, for the last 40 years, probably longer, we have been an indispensable ally to Taiwan, a democracy. The people in Taiwan fled mainland China after World War II because they didn't want to live under communist dictatorship. If you don't want to live under communist dictatorship, let's try to help those who have the same view. Democracy is a good thing, not a bad thing. So the likelihood of China being aggressive to Taiwan has gone through the roof if Putin doesn't pay a price. The biggest game changer of all is Iran. So I spent 5-6 days in the Mideast before I went to Munich. I realized that the Russian-Ukraine situation is on the front page of every newspaper in the world now, and it's very important. But the biggest game changer of all is if we allow the Ayatollah in Iran, who's a religious Nazi, to acquire a nuclear weapon, we're going to have a war in the Mideast out of revelations. So anything you give the Iranians, the Arabs are going to want the same thing. And if you don't believe me, go speak to the Arabs. I met the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia. I met the entire national security infrastructure of the United Arab Emirates, who has nuclear power, but they don't enrich themselves. They told me unequivocally, anything you give the Iranians, our mortal enemy, the Shiite Ayatollah, then we're going to want the same thing. You'll have a nuclear arms race in the Mideast in the next 2 years if you don't watch it. Now, how do you stop all that? You can have all the nuclear power you want in the region, but nobody should be allowed to make their fuel. Bob Menendez and myself, the senator from New Jersey, and myself, want to create an international fuel bank so that every power, Arab and Iranian power in the Mideast, can have all the nuclear power they want, but none of them make their own fuel. Because making the fuel is how you make a bomb. So I do believe that the JCPOA round 2 is coming pretty soon. That will be inadequate when it comes to controlling Iran's nuclear ambitions. And I am ready to introduce shortly red lines for the Iranian nuclear program. So the JCPOA will tell Iran what they can do in the area of enrichment. I'm going to tell the Iranians what they cannot do regarding their nuclear program. I'm going to create red lines in the area of enrichment. That's how you make a weapon. Weaponization, when you take the enriched uranium and you begin to create a bomb, that's a process that I want to make sure that if they go down that road, they pay a price. And finally, if you have a bomb, how do you deliver it? I want red lines around their missile program. So I met with the Israelis. They're going to provide me some advice and counsel about what red lines should look like regarding the Iranian nuclear ambitions. I want the Iranians to know what you can't do. If we had such a concept with North Korea, they'd never had a bomb. Israel's not going to allow Iran to produce a nuclear weapon without one hell of a fight. So what happens if Putin gets away with it? The Iranians are going to believe that we don't have the will to stop their nuclear ambitions. What happens if Putin gets away with it in Ukraine? China is, just as sure as I'm standing here, will be more aggressive toward Taiwan, and Taiwan's days are numbered. The opposite is true. If Putin does pay a price, and we finally stand up to his thuggery, and we take the yachts and homes and bank accounts of the oligarchs away from them, if we crush the ruble, then maybe China and Iran would think differently. This is the most important time in world history since the end of World War II.
Senator, first of all, have you talked to President Biden at all since you got back?
No, I spoke to Vice President Harris in Munich. I thought she gave a good speech. The news conference, not so much. I told her that you have made a decision not to lay sanctions out early, not to let Putin read what will happen to him. You're trying to create some mystery as deterrence. It's not working. And it's clear now it didn't work. So my reach to the Biden administration, reach out, is through Democratic senators. Next week, let's do an emergency supplemental to help our friends and our allies and to help ourselves. And also, let's come up with bipartisan sanctions supported by the administration that would send a clear signal to the oligarchs in Russia, what's coming your way, would make life miserable for the ruble and the international economy, and would start providing alternatives to Russian oil and gas for our European allies. So I want a sanctions regime from hell next week.
Biden is set to address the nation this afternoon at 2 o'clock, Senator. He's going to lay out sanctions against Russia. Too little, too late?
Well, it's not too little too late if they can change behavior. Well, what we've seen here is by declaring the 2 cities in eastern Ukraine independent of Ukraine, you basically dismembered the Ukraine. It's an attack on the democratic status of Ukraine. It is the breaking of the Minsk agreement in 2014 and 2015. It's tearing up of the Buddhist memorandum. So the basis of the discussion by President Biden today should be to restore world order. He should make a speech, in my view, that says it's not just about Russia and Ukraine. It's about world order. It's about the word of the United States. It's about enticing people to do good things and get rewarded when they do, not do good things and wind up regretting it. So I'm hoping that the president will explain Russia, Ukraine in terms of our national security interest, what it would mean to the world if we get this wrong. Reach out to Republicans and Democrats in Congress. I can tell you on our side, there are few voices that believe Ukraine doesn't matter, but they're few in number. The average Republican member of Congress is more like Ronald Reagan, who believes in a strong world order, who believes in the rule of law and that democracy is a good thing. We're not looking to send U.S. forces on the ground in Ukraine, but we should send an unequivocal signal to Russia and the oligarchs around Putin that this cannot stand and will not be tolerated. So the administration has had the wrong approach. They've withheld being clear about sanctions. It didn't work. Their initial description of seizing of these two cities, declaring them independent of Ukraine by Putin, was to say that's not an invasion. They changed a few hours ago because that was silly. So their inclination is to be minimalist. Their inclination is to appease. That needs to change. Mr. President, when you speak to the nation today at 2 o'clock, I promise you, my good friend John McCain, I can only imagine what he would be saying today. I promise you there are a bunch of Republicans that will stand firmly with you to push back against this outrage by Putin and to reset the world order. I also promise you if you try to soft sell this and you don't push back hard, that the Republican Party will be an alternative to what you're suggesting.
Any comments on Special Counsel John Durham's recent court filing that...
People made predictions about the Mueller report that were not true. What I read in the Durham filings were disturbing, but I'm going to wait to read it for myself.
Senator Graham, just follow up with that supplemental situation. You're talking about a task force. Is there a price tag associated with this at this point?
Well,
when it comes to aid as well?
That's a good question. So, number one, the developing world, in terms of vaccination, we need to help them with the COVID. There's a reemergence of another strain, I think it's called B2. The WHO briefed us about that today. There's another strain that's kind of a one-off of Omicron, more contagious, not more lethal, but the chance of this thing coming back again is going up. So I think we need to do some things in the developing world to help us with future COVID problems. Let's take an opportunity now to do some things that make the world a safer and better place. I'm hoping we'll do something on the border. But the task force to me is very important. I want the oligarchs to understand what's coming their way, the price that you're going to pay. I literally want to work with the British government and the German government to have a sort of united front, because a lot of these assets are in London, they're in Berlin, they're in New York, and these assets have been generated by an association with Putin to the detriment of the Russian people and world stability. That's one thing that I think is very bipartisan. I want to see cops go in and take apartments, fine art, seize yachts from a bunch of thugs and crooks. I want to put money on the table to have more weapons for Ukraine to fight. I want more protection when it comes to cyber. And I want to go at this big, and I want to go at it hard.
Senator, how important would you say nonpartisanship is right now? We've spoken to people locally from the Ukraine who say the last thing they want to see here is division in our country.
I think bipartisanship is important if the purpose of bipartisanship makes us safe. So in the 30s, you had plenty of unity, and it was all wrong. You had a lone voice called Churchill that said, what you're doing is not going to work. And he was proven to be right. So there is bipartisanship to go after the oligarchs. I think there's bipartisanship to beef up NATO. I think there's bipartisanship for biting sanctions. Count me in for bipartisanship. But count me out when bipartisanship takes off the table things that will matter. I am hoping that we can put together a bipartisan package. But the one thing that I need to hear from the administration is they realize that what they did didn't work. If you think what you're doing is working, then it would be hard for me to work with you in the future, because it's clearly not. So what I'm looking for is a bipartisan package that realizes that what we've done in the past did not work, and that we're changing the approach.
Senator Graham, at the Olympics, Putin was at the Olympics, and affirmed his support of China and Taiwan, which is there any concern, I'm sure there's a lot based on what you said, that you've talked a little bit about the fall of the Soviet Union, that they're trying to build it back up?
Well, listen to his speech. I mean, this was the most provocative speech since the end of World War II. It is a rewriting of the European map. What Putin did yesterday is announce that Ukraine as a sovereign nation is null and void. I consider it to be part of Russia. And I consider territories that were part of the Soviet Union that are now independent really still belong to us, the Russian Empire. It was a direct challenge to the transatlantic partnership. It was a direct challenge to the makeup of Europe, and what we do will determine how far he goes. Ukraine is not the only ambition of Putin. There are other people in the region that he has his eyes on. So I am hoping that President Biden at 2 o'clock will tell the nation about other things that Putin wants. I'm hoping that he realizes that Putin is going to help China if it came to taking Taiwan. And here's the good news for us all. Russia has a pair of twos, and the West has a full house. They have an economy the size of Italy, depending on basically one source, oil and gas. We could crush their economy. We don't need soldiers in Ukraine. We need a united world front by Western nations that would take off the table the rich lifestyle of the oligarchs, that would create alternatives to Russian oil and gas. We could crush their economy, and the ruble should go in the tank.
How bad is an invasion by Russia going to affect gas prices at the local level?
Well, it's going to increase gas prices dramatically, and this is an invasion, but he's not done yet. I had one colleague of mine suggest that maybe, he'll give us Western Ukraine if we give him Eastern Ukraine. The last time we tried that game was with Hitler. If you listen to what Putin said yesterday, the Ukraine as a sovereign nation does not exist in his eyes. So the disruption to the oil and gas markets will be severe. I would expect that oil prices per barrel will be pushing $100 north of that because supply has been interrupted. I would expect that commodities in the grocery store, you'll feel that soon, because Ukraine was a big exporter of corn and wheat, and when they're taken out of the marketplace, prices will go up.
So with that said, Biden recently tapped into the reserves. Any shot at all of getting the Keystone back going?
So this is where bipartisanship will have its limits. The Democratic Party is going to fight my efforts, Senator Rubio and others, to restart the Keystone Pipeline. I want votes on whether or not we should open up the Keystone Pipeline. I want to open up areas of the United States been taken off the map for oil and gas exploration. I believe in a lower carbon economy over time, but we have a national security crisis on our hands. In 2018, we were energy independent. Now we're dependent. We're more dependent on oil and gas from Russia than any time in recent memory. Let's change that equation. If you really want to hurt Putin, create oil and gas options for the Europeans and try to march toward a lower carbon economy all at the same time. I am going to insist that we secure our border. After being in the Mideast, it's clear to me that radical Islam is on the march, and they're looking at coming back to the United States, and the most likely entry point is a broken border. So I'm going to be talking about that too. Now, whether or not the Democratic Party and President Biden can adjust their energy policies, I don't know. Whether or not they're going to take border security more seriously, I don't know. But if they don't, I will.
So, Senator Graham, do you have any messages to U.S. shale oil producers who really aren't ramping up production right now, even with oil near $100 a barrel?
I would go forward to the extent the law would allow. We're going to have a great debate in the United States Congress. We're about to have an election in November. I want to vote. in the United States Senate about reopening Keystone. I want to vote about expanding the extraction through fracking, an environmentally sound way, gas deposits that are plentiful in the United States. We could send to Europe liquefied natural gas to make up for a lot of what they will lose if they shut down the pipelines coming out of Russia. Whether or not that happens or not, I want to vote as to whether it should. Going into 2022, I want to make sure that the American people understand where the Republican Party is at on energy independence and border security. In the time in which we live, this dangerous time, I want bipartisanship around concepts that will matter. So count me in for bipartisanship, but also count me in for making sure that we pursue policies that will make it safer.
Senator, does the Budapest Agreement, are we obligated in any way to help the Ukraine in this situation?
It was a memorandum, and the opening paragraph said that for giving up your nuclear force, which was the third largest in the world, the borders and sovereignty of Ukraine would be honored and respected and not challenged by force. It was not a mutual defense agreement, but it was written in a fashion to entice Ukraine to give up nukes for the promise that you'll be an independent nation. You won't need nuclear weapons because nobody's going to bother you. Well, how well did that work out? So the Budapest Memorandum was an effort to get nuclear weapons consolidated to make the world a safer place. Putin ripped up the agreement, and looking back, Ukraine made a fatal mistake by trusting us and Russia to live up to the agreement. We can't afford any more of those fatal mistakes. We can't afford to let Israel believe we don't have their back when it comes to an Iranian nuclear program. We can't afford to let our allies in Asia believe we will abandon them if China tries to take their land by force. Because if we do that, then the world economy is going to fall apart, and we're going to live in some of the most dangerous times since World War II. One last question.
Off topic.
Yeah.
There's some families in Oconee County that have missing loved ones. They said they've reached out to your office to ask for assistance. Is that something that you can do with SLED or the FBI to help them find their loved ones?
Yeah, they're going to brief me here in a minute about, yes, absolutely. I will make sure that if your loved one is missing, that the law enforcement community is doing all they reasonably can to find your loved one. And let's end on this. To the Ukrainian Americans who have come and made your home America, your ancestral home is under siege. Your family and friends in Ukraine are being threatened. Their very existence is now in question. I have spent time with President Zelensky. I have great admiration for Ukrainian people. I think Putin is about to make a huge mistake. I believe Ukraine will fight back. It is definitely a mismatch, but holding Ukraine could be like Afghanistan for the Russians. I think it is in our national security interest to make sure that there is a resistance movement in Ukraine, that we support it. So my thoughts and prayers are with the people of Ukraine who relied on the United States. My thoughts and prayers with the Ukrainian Americans who have loved ones in harm's way. My final thought and prayer is that President Biden will rise to the occasion. Nothing would please me more than to work with Joe Biden to end this invasion by Russia in a way that would make the world safer and stronger. I would like for him to expand the Abraham Accords to have new Muslim nations working with Israel. I will do what I can to help him on all fronts when it comes to foreign policy. So, Mr. President, you have a chance to reset the world and your own administration after Afghanistan. Seize the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator.